The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and suffocating. All you do is eat but don't help around here. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to live. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and please tell me and others, what's one life lesson everyone should hear before it's too late? Share it in the comments below. Thanks. My daughter-in-law Jessica's voice cut through the evening quiet of what I had foolishly believed was my home. I sat at the kitchen table, a half-eaten bowl of soup growing cold before me, my arthritic hands still trembling from the effort of lifting the spoon. My son Christopher didn't look up from his phone. Not a word of defense, not even a glance in my direction. The silence that followed was deafening. My grandson Oliver, only 8 years old, stopped coloring and looked between us with wide, confused eyes. Children always know when the adults have crossed a line, even when they don't understand what that line was. I had been living with them for 2 years, ever since the stroke that left me unsteady on my feet and struggling with simple tasks. What had started as a temporary arrangement while I recovered had somehow become permanent, though no one had ever actually asked me if I wanted it to be. I see, I said quietly, setting down my spoon with deliberate care. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't remind Jessica that I had been the one to watch Oliver every day after school for the past year while she worked her part-time job. I didn't mention that I still cooked dinner 3 nights a week, despite the pain in my joints. I didn't point out that my Social Security check helped pay their mortgage. Instead, I simply stood up, cleared my bowl, and walked to my room, the converted den with no door and a fold-out couch that had become my entire world. That night, I lay awake listening to them laugh in the living room, the sound of the television mixing with their casual conversation. They had already moved on, as if the woman who had raised one of them and helped raise the other was nothing more than an inconvenience to be discussed and dismissed. I thought about my late husband, William, and how he used to say that family was everything. How he'd worked 2 jobs to make sure Christopher had everything he needed. How we'd scrimped and saved to help with his college tuition, his wedding, the down payment on this very house. William had been gone for 5 years now, and sometimes I wondered if he'd be proud of the man our son had become, or if he'd be as disappointed as I was in this moment. The next morning, I made coffee as usual. I folded the laundry that had been sitting in the basket for 3 days. I helped Oliver find his library book and made his lunch. Jessica barely acknowledged me, and Christopher had already left for work. It was as if the previous evening had never happened, except for the cold distance that now filled the space between us. But something had shifted inside me. A quiet resolve was building, like water behind a dam that's been holding back pressure for too long. 3 days later, while they were at Oliver's soccer game, an event I was no longer invited to attend, I made a phone call. Dorothy. The voice on the other end was warm and familiar. Helen had been my best friend since high school, and she'd moved to a senior community in Arizona 2 years ago. Helen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course, honey. What's wrong? I told her everything. The words poured out of me like water from a broken pipe, the constant criticism, the way they made me feel like a burden, the loneliness of living in a house where I was tolerated rather than loved. Oh, Dorothy, Helen said when I finished. You can't stay there. You know that, don't you? But where would I go? I can't afford much on my own. Listen to me. You have options. You have more options than you think. That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. I started making quiet inquiries, researching, and planning. I discovered that the senior community where Helen lived had a waiting list, but they also had temporary housing available. More importantly, I learned something that changed everything. I called William's old friend, Richard, who had been our financial advisor for decades. We met at a coffee shop downtown, away from prying eyes and ears. Dorothy, I'm so glad you called, Richard said, sliding a manila folder across the table. I've been wondering when you'd want to discuss this. Discuss what? The investments William set up before he died. The ones he specifically designated for your independence. I stared at him, confused. What investments? Richard opened the folder, revealing documents I'd never seen before. William was very concerned about your future. He set up a separate investment account in your name only. He made me promise not to tell you about it unless you specifically asked, or unless you found yourself in a situation where you needed financial independence. The numbers on the page made my head spin. Over the years, William's careful investments had grown into a substantial sum, enough to live comfortably on my own for the rest of my life. He knew, I whispered. He knew what? He knew this might happen. That I might need to take care of myself. Richard nodded sadly. William was a wise man. He loved Christopher, but he also knew that people change, and circumstances change. He wanted to make sure you'd never be dependent on anyone. I left that meeting with a new sense of purpose. For the first time in years, I felt like I had choices. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, making lists. Jessica was in the living room, complaining loudly on the phone to her sister about how exhausting it was to have me around. Christopher was in the garage, avoiding the conversation as usual. I wrote down everything I'd contributed to their household over the past 2 years. Not just financially, but all the ways I'd helped that had gone unnoticed and unappreciated. The childcare that would have cost them hundreds of dollars a week. The cooking, cleaning, and household management I'd done despite my physical limitations. The emotional support I'd provided during Christopher's job loss last year. Then I wrote down everything I'd given up. My independence. My dignity. My sense of self-worth. The small apartment I'd loved, with its garden view and friendly neighbors. The book club I'd belonged to for 15 years. The volunteer work at the hospital that had given my life meaning. The list was longer than I'd expected, and more painful to write than I'd anticipated. The next morning, I made my decision. I'll be moving out at the end of the month, I announced over breakfast. Jessica looked up from her phone, surprised. Moving out? Where? I found a place in Arizona, near my friend Helen. Christopher finally spoke. Mom, you don't have to do that. Jessica didn't mean. Yes, she did, I said calmly. And she was right. It is time for me to find somewhere else to live. But how will you afford it? Jessica asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice, not for me, but for the loss of my financial contribution to their household. I'll manage, I said simply. What I didn't tell them was that I'd already put a deposit down on a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a senior community that offered everything I'd been missing: independence, respect, and a community of people who understood what it meant to be dismissed by their own families. I also didn't tell them about the other decision I'd made. The house they lived in, the house William and I had bought 40 years ago, the house we'd raised Christopher in, the house I'd signed over to him when William died because I wanted to help my son build his future, that house was about to be sold. You see, what Christopher had never bothered to read in the deed transfer was the small print that William's lawyer had insisted on including. The house was Christopher's, but only as long as I was welcome to live there. If I ever chose to leave because I felt unwelcome, ownership would revert back to me. William had been protecting me even from the grave. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly packing my belongings and making arrangements. I hired a real estate agent, a lovely woman named Patricia who specialized in quick sales. The house was in a desirable neighborhood and would sell fast. Are you sure about this, Mrs. Caldwell? Patricia asked when I signed the listing agreement. This is a big decision. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, I replied. I arranged for a moving company to pack and ship my belongings to Arizona. I said goodbye to the neighbors who had become friends over the decades, many of whom were shocked to learn I was leaving. But this is your home, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door said, tears in her eyes. No, I replied. This was my house. My home is wherever I'm valued and respected. On my last day, I sat in the kitchen one final time, drinking coffee from the mug William had given me for our 25th anniversary. Christopher had already left for work. Jessica was getting Oliver ready for school. "Grandma, why are you leaving?" Oliver asked, climbing onto my lap despite being almost too big for it. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people need to find new places where they can be happy," I said, smoothing his hair. "But won't you be sad without us?" I hugged him tight, breathing in his little boy smell of shampoo and cold playground dirt. "I'll miss you terribly. But I'll be okay. And maybe someday, you can come visit me in Arizona." Jessica appeared in the doorway, car keys in hand. For a moment, she looked almost regretful. "Dorothy, I hope you know that we didn't want you to feel unwelcome." I looked at her for a long moment. "Jessica, I hope someday you understand what it feels like to give everything you have to your family, only to be told you're not enough." She had the grace to look ashamed, but it was too late for apologies. After they left, I walked through the empty rooms one last time. In the living room, I could see the ghost of Christmas mornings when Christopher was small. In the kitchen, I remembered teaching him to make pancakes on Saturday mornings. In the backyard, I could almost hear William's laughter as he pushed Christopher on the swing set we'd built together. But those were memories of a different time, a different family. The people who lived here now were strangers who happened to share my DNA. I left the house key on the kitchen counter, along with a sealed envelope containing a letter I'd written the night before. Then I called my taxi and left for the airport. The letter was simple. "Christopher and Jessica. By the time you read this, I'll be on my way to Arizona. I want you to know that I don't leave in anger, but in sadness that we couldn't find a way to be a family that honored each other. You'll be receiving some paperwork in the next few days. The house is being sold. According to the original deed transfer, ownership reverted to me when I chose to leave because I felt unwelcome. The sale should close within 30 days. I'm not doing this to hurt you, but to free all of us. You'll no longer have to worry about caring for a burden, and I'll no longer have to pretend that being tolerated is the same as being loved. The money from the sale will allow me to live independently for the rest of my life. I hope it also teaches you something about the value of treating family with kindness and respect. Christopher, I love you. I always will. But I love myself too much to continue living somewhere I'm not wanted. I hope someday you'll understand. Mom." The flight to Arizona was the first time I'd traveled alone in decades. As the plane lifted off, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. Helen was waiting for me at the airport, her face beaming with joy. "Dorothy, you look wonderful." "I feel wonderful," I said, and realized it was true. My new apartment was everything I'd hoped for. Bright and airy, with a small balcony overlooking a garden. The community center offered art classes, book clubs, and volunteer opportunities. My neighbors were friendly and welcoming, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. 3 weeks after I left, my phone rang. It was Christopher. "Mom, we got the papers. You can't sell the house. This is our home." "It was my home first," I said calmly. "For 40 years before you were born, and for 18 years while you grew up in it. But where are we supposed to live? We can't afford to buy another house right now. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're both intelligent adults." "Mom, please." Jessica's sorry about what she said. "We all are. Can't we work this out?" I was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the Arizona sunset painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Christopher, do you remember when you were 12 and you broke Mrs. Patterson's window with your baseball? What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what your father and I taught you about taking responsibility for your actions?" "Yes, but..." "There are no buts, son. You made choices. Jessica made choices. Now you get to live with the consequences of those choices, just like everyone else. So that's it. You're just going to abandon your family. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. No, Christopher. I'm just going to stop letting my family abandon me. I hung up the phone and turned it off. I had a pottery class to attend, and I didn't want to be late. 6 months later, I received a letter from Oliver. Jessica had helped him write it, but I could tell the words were his own. Dear Grandma, I miss you. Mom and Dad say you're mad at us, but I don't understand why. I hope you're happy in Arizona. I saw pictures of the desert and it looks pretty. We had to move to a smaller house. Mom cries sometimes. Dad works a lot. I wish you would come back. Love, Oliver. I cried when I read it, but they weren't tears of regret. They were tears for a little boy caught in the middle of adult mistakes, and tears of gratitude that I'd found the strength to choose myself. I wrote back to Oliver, sending him pictures of my new life, the art classes, the garden club, the friends I'd made. I told him about the volunteer work I was doing at the local elementary school, reading to children his age. I promised that when he was older, if he wanted to visit, he'd always be welcome. But I didn't offer to come back. Some bridges, once burned, are meant to stay that way. A year later, Helen and I were sitting on my balcony, watching the sunset and sharing a bottle of wine. Do you ever regret it? She asked. I thought about the question seriously. Did I regret leaving the family I'd devoted my life to? Did I regret selling the house that held 40 years of memories? Did I regret choosing my own dignity over their convenience? No, I said finally. I regret that it took me so long to realize I deserved better. What would you tell other women in similar situations? I sipped my wine and watched a roadrunner dart across the courtyard below. I'd tell them that love isn't supposed to make you smaller. Real love, the kind worth having, makes you bigger, stronger, more yourself. If the people in your life are constantly making you feel like you're too much trouble, too expensive, too needy, too old, too anything, then maybe the problem isn't you. And if they're afraid to leave, I'd tell them that being alone is better than being lonely in a room full of people who are supposed to love you. I'd tell them that it's never too late to choose yourself, even if you're 75 years old and everyone expects you to just be grateful for whatever scraps of affection they throw your way. Helen raised her glass. To choose ourselves. To choose ourselves, I agreed, clinking my glass against hers. As the stars began to appear in the desert sky, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I thought about William, and how proud he would be that I'd finally used the gift he'd left me, not just the money, but the reminder that I was worth protecting, even from our own son. I thought about Christopher and Jessica, probably struggling in their smaller house, maybe finally understanding what they'd lost when they decided I was disposable. I hoped they were learning to value what they had before it was gone. And I thought about Oliver, growing up in a family that was learning hard lessons about respect and consequences. Maybe someday, when he was older, he'd understand why his grandmother had to leave to find her way back to herself. But mostly, I thought about tomorrow. About the watercolor class I was taking, the book club meeting I was hosting, the new friend I was having lunch with. About all the tomorrows stretching ahead of me, full of possibility and free from the weight of other people's expectations. I had spent 75 years being what everyone else needed me to be. Now, finally, I was learning who I was when I belonged to myself. And she was magnificent. The desert wind whispered through the palm trees, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and I smiled, recognizing a kindred spirit, another creature who had learned that sometimes, to survive, you have to leave the familiar behind and trust that you're strong enough to make it on your own. I was.